The Psychology of Murder by Casey Lytle. Episode 4, Romantic Attraction to Killers. So why am I making this one episode 4? Why are we doing this one right now? Well, it's been a while since we've had a high-profile murderer getting a lot of media attention, in this case Bryan Kohberger in Idaho, who has apparently a romantic fan. Either writing him letters or showing public interest in him. This is nothing new. Ted Bundy we had the same experience with him. He actually proposed to someone, Carol Ann Boone, while she was on the stand during his trial, and ended up marrying her and is possibly the father of her child. So this is something that really got attention with Bundy. He received hundreds of fan letters, proposals, pictures, things like that in the mail. And this kind of started the study of that. And obviously people who experience this aren't necessarily going to volunteer for psychological study, but we can get some profiles here and predictions based on what we find from their lives and from their history. This whole idea of romantic attraction or interest, not just in killers, but in people who commit crimes, was coined Hybristophilia. And this came from sexologist John Money in one of his books back in 1986. And to paraphrase him, he mentioned it as erotic attraction to a partner who has a predatory history of outrages perpetuated on others. Hybristophilia is not specified in the 5th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or in any of the editions for that matter, for the very same reason we don't bother to list all of the phobias. Phobias and paraphilias, phobia and paraphilia in general is listed in the book, but the key with both of those is anything can become the object of a phobia or paraphilia. You just have to pair something with fear, you can develop a phobia. You pair something to sexual attraction or arousal, and you can develop a paraphilia. Nothing is immune from that. It just requires the pairing. Sometimes the pairing can become dangerous. And when we see aggression associated with sexual arousal, then aggression itself becomes arousal. So that can be dangerous. This attraction is also, as you could guess, just an extreme version of the attraction to the bad boy, right? Which can be motivated just by a desire for excitement, the excitement a bad boy can bring in the environment, rebellion against a restrictive family, and in a lot of cases, a form of seeking protection. Why is that? Well, this is where you get into people where you can find a history of abuse, either in upbringing or in previous relationships. People coming out of abusive environments, it is a spectrum of response, but you can anchor that with people who come out rather passive and are always looking for a protector, which of course puts you at high risk of falling into the hands of someone who is just like the abuser you escaped. The other one is someone who goes to the extreme of desiring control. You can have, in the cases of people who are attracted to murderers, there's the extreme of aggression. You can have people with abuse histories seeking protection. You can also have people who feel a desire to control or nurture someone like that. And obviously in some of these cases, the attraction isn't one that they want actual in their real life because the person is in prison and likely to stay there. It's likely just a fantasy that is played out in letters, or today played out just in comments online in different social media environments without even contacting the person directly. You can, in some rare cases, also have attraction to the crime itself, where the attraction to the person, again, is because of the crime they committed. And the person, in this case, is developing kind of a paraphilia toward violence and associates it with the partner. So again, we mentioned Bundy, Bryan Kohberger. There's a woman who is getting media attention for being romantically interested in Kohberger. Now, there is kind of an interesting one. I've only seen a couple people bring this up. Catherine Ramsland, the forensic expert who actually wrote the book on BTK, she was at DeSales University in Pennsylvania. Brian Kohberger apparently, to some degree, studied under her. I don't know the extent to that, if that just means he took classes from her or if he was part of a research group. But she actually wrote an article on this. I believe it was in possibly Psychology Today, some other publication, but it was in April 2012 on women who love serial killers and what drives women to the attraction to serial killers. That made some people say, did Kohberger do this thinking he would get a girlfriend or get people who would be romantically attracted to him? I would say that's very low possibility that that would have been his motivation here, because nothing of the supposed research he put out there last spring seemed to be looking in that direction. Now, Hybristophilia is also sometimes called the Bonnie and Clyde syndrome because of Bonnie Parker's attraction to Clyde and his criminal history. Again, we can see a desire to change the person. The one I haven't mentioned here is media attention. Sometimes people will jump on this knowing it's going to get a lot of attention and put the spotlight on them. It can also sometimes be seen as the perfect relationship in that you never have to encounter the person in an uncontrolled environment. They're going to be in prison. You always know where they are and what they're doing. And when you do, if you do go meet them, in some cases of people who marry people in prison, it is going to be in a controlled, relatively safe environment. It is almost like a controlled fantasy played out in real life. And as we'll mention several times, when it comes to taboo or socially unacceptable things played out in fantasy, fantasy isn't always an indicator. Actually, it's a very poor indicator of a person's actual behavior, because fantasy is a completely controlled environment. You can decide when to have the fantasy, when to stop it. You determine everything that goes on in the fantasy. Whereas in the real world, you don't control those things. So in the case of someone who's in prison, there is an element of social control around that. You don't have to worry about them showing up unannounced at your door. There's no outside real world threat, especially in cases of life in prison without the possibility of parole or people who are on death row. Some of these are also possibly narcissistic enablers, people who fuel narcissists and are attracted to the power of the person. And obviously there's no greater, when it comes to violence and crime, indicator of power than a person willing to take someone else's life. In the case of the person interested in Brian Kohberger, if you look into her past, she has a child from someone who either was in prison or is still in prison. So this does seem to be something consistent with the drives around her. So nothing new. It's actually, almost anticipated when something like this happens, especially when it gets a lot of publicity. And again, Kohberger is one that we haven't had a peak of publicity around a case like this in someone, especially of his age range, for a while. So while that internet sleuth interest is high, you have someone coming in there and jumping in on the possible publicity that could bring them, even if there is no genuine interest in him. Now, frequently there are cases of people who will start writing or visiting people in prison who are in for violent crimes or crimes outside of murder, who will eventually get released and do hook up with them once they're out, become their partner once they get released. Again, this can be a high-risk environment, and quite often this is someone who is prone to be seeking protection, a protector, and in doing so can actually find the next person who is a risk to them by doing so. How can they not spot this? Because of the belief that this is someone that won't do that to them, that their feeling of attraction to the person, they interpret that as a intuitive sense that the person won't harm them, that aggression will simply be used to protect them. And that's the rationale you can get there. When it comes to people falling into abusive relationships, you never go into one unless you would have a very specific self-harm paraphilia, thinking the person would do it. You feel a sense that they would never do that. Even though when it comes to women in the U.S., current or former intimate partners are the largest single identifiable demographic who will cause harm to you. And again, part of what opens the door for that is not believing they would do that, not recognizing that signs of aggression you see early could be pointed in your direction eventually, the belief that it wouldn't happen. Would this person be interested in Kohberger if something happens and the case gets thrown out or a mistrial is declared or whatever circumstance could happen to get him out on a technicality? Would the person want to hook up with him then? We would have to wait and see how that would actually play out, or if even he would have any interest in pursuing someone like that. If we look more general outside of romantic interest, we can see this kind of draw in people who are drawn toward aggressive people, especially kind of controlling aggressive people, because it feels safe within the environment, that it feels like you are in a safer position if you connect yourself or bond yourself with a powerful person, an aggressive person, again, believing they won't turn that aggression on you. They'll use that aggression to protect you in the environment. As Catherine Ramsland specified in her April of 2012 article on women who love serial killers, she addressed the evolutionary model of how this could happen, going after the ultimate alpha male. That when we look in primate populations in which the males are constantly competing to be the primary alpha male, and that tends to be the one that attracts the most potential mates in the population, that kind of aggression represents protection, genetic superiority, and genetic health, but again, is not perceived as a threat to self. So there are a lot of more mild examples of this. The people who are attracted to murderers, obviously the ultimate form of aggression, simply seem to be an extreme of this. As some people would point out, though, especially in the case of some of the incel killers, such as Elliot Rodger, they don't actually demonstrate a lot of alpha male traits. In fact, in many cases of incel populations, it's the inability to live up to an alpha male type of expectation or norm that drives their frustration and drives their anger toward women who reject them and toward men who are successful. If we were to parallel them into the primate population, that example I gave, they would be the ones who aren't the most aggressive and successful of the alpha males. They would be the ones who are aggressive towards the females who reject them and have a lot of hostility towards the ones who reach the top of the alpha male category. Is that why possibly in incel populations we don't get the same number of people who come pouring out of the woodwork interested, such as we saw with Ted Bundy? You didn't see as many when it came to Elliot Rodger, the Santa Barbara shooter. What you saw with Elliot Rodger was a lot of other incel-type males kind of glamorizing him as the ultimate gentleman and using him as their model because he tried to achieve something that they have been unable to achieve. He worked his way up the ladder just through the reputation of the murders he committed, but he doesn't quite fit the other category. Although Kohberger, as I mentioned before, does seem to fit the incel category, we don't necessarily know enough about him to know he wouldn't fit alpha male in other arrangements. He did, according to reports by his friends, somewhere in high school between junior and senior year, kind of flip from having been bullied for most of his life to becoming the bully. So he became more aggressive and forceful around that time. How that worked into his day-to-day life over the 10 years between then and when he committed the murders, it's hard to know, but he did seem to be heading in that trajectory. Is that one of the things that this woman who is getting media attention for being attracted to him, is that one of the things that draws? Not just the murders he committed, but that history of becoming dominant and becoming the bully. Would that put him more into that category for her. You can see this as a mixed bag, but it's not an unusual one. It's not unpredictable. There's a history of it. You can find entire subreddits dedicated to these populations and their stories of their attraction to these people. Again, most of them do not ever directly contact the person. They play it out online. They play it out in fantasy. They play out fantasy of being with the person or being victim of the person. And that's where we get into more of a sexualized paraphilia around the crime, not as much about around the person. But again, as in any fantasy, it's a safe environment where you're not attracting the real threat into your real world. Then we can go on that spectrum to the point where people will write to the person, maybe not even expecting to get anything back. Maybe they get a thrill just from the idea of sending that email or putting that letter in the mail. Perhaps that generates excitement. But again, if it's someone in prison for life or on death row, even if you start communicating with them, there is no threat of any direct interaction ever happening unless it's a controlled one by your choice to go there and visit. And even then, it is a safe, controlled environment. So again, something that ranges all the way from fantasy to the extreme there, Carol Ann Boone, of actually marrying the person that she was obsessed with. It can go to those extremes. But again, it's not unusual. It's something we're aware of. We study it, and it's expected. I lay this one down here as a nugget because as we go through and look at cases later on, do other episodes, this may be something we refer back to as an element there, or even something, in some cases, we might predict before media grabs on it, if it's the kind of case that would fit this. So another foundation piece we're sticking in here that we'll be coming back to later on.